Joining me right now, CNN senior military analyst, retired Admiral James Stavridis. Thank you so much for being here. Focusing in on this blockade that is set to set in, according to U.S. Central Command, at 10 a.m. Eastern. If this happens, what is a blockade going to look like in reality, Admiral? And practically, what is going to be required of the U.S. Navy to pull it off?
Well, let's start with a little bit of confusion over what the intent is here. What we heard from President Trump initially was a full and complete blockade, a shutdown, if you will, of the Strait of Hormuz. What has now developed and what we're hearing from Central Command, Admiral Brad Cooper, the commander, is more nuanced and I think the right answer, which is to blockade the Iranian ports. That's an important distinction. So let's assume it's the latter. How do you do that? You need 1 or 2 aircraft carriers in the region to put up air cover. You need a dozen surface combatants, Kate, so cruisers, frigates, destroyers, to actually station themselves off the Iranian ports. You need a couple of dozen small, fast patrol craft. The Emirates and the Saudis have these kind of craft, corvettes, patrol boats, and then you're going to need land-based air to maintain air superiority. So this will be a huge and resource-intensive effort. And I'll close with this. The good news is, having now pounded the Iranians militarily, this goes after their economy, but it does it in a way that doesn't blow up the entire oil infrastructure. So let's see how the blockade unfolds, but it's going to be resource intensive and it could be very risky.
I'll play something that Democratic Senator Mark Warner said about this and the question on the connection between imposing a blockade and the broader objective of the United States to get the Strait of Hormuz fully reopened. Let me play this.
But I don't understand how blockading the Strait is going to somehow push the Iranians into opening it. I don't get the connection there. You're going to see these energy prices continue at record levels, not for weeks, but months and years. And how blockading the Strait gets it open suddenly, I don't get that logic.
What do you think of that?
I think that is a very common response across the country, is just head scratching. How does this work? And this gets back, Kate, to where we started the conversation. It's the distinction between simply shutting down the Strait completely, which is what I think Senator Warner is responding to, and the more nuanced closure of the Iranian ports, because these are two different tasks. Blockading Iran will, in fact, hurt their economy deeply. They depend on oil coming out of those ports. The second task is to open the Strait for everybody else. That's where I think this has landed in the cold light of a Monday morning. So watch for U.S. Navy and hopefully European minesweepers to go into that Strait next, clear it for everybody else while we blockade the Iranian ports. I think that is what the administration is intending here.
Does it effectively do what they are intending, which would be cripple the Iranian economy? Do you think a blockade like this can completely stop Iranians from getting their oil out, or are there cracks in the system?
Of course, there will be cracks in the system. Think back to our own history, Kate. American Civil War, the North blockaded the South. Thousands of miles of coastline, took hundreds and hundreds of U.S. Navy ships. Plan Anaconda, named for the snake that constricts its opponent. What the administration aims to do is to accomplish that, but it could take time. It took 3 years plus in the American Civil War to really bring that Confederate economy to its knees. That's the hope here. And last thought, we should recognize Iran will continue to have options here. They can put more mines in the Strait. They can use terrorism globally. They can use cyber attacks, perhaps aided by the Russians. They still have cards to play, and the one that worries me the most, they could go after the Gulf Arab states' oil infrastructure using short-range ballistic missiles and terror. So this staring contest between Tehran and Washington is about to come to a culmination. We'll see who blinks.
Joining me now is Colonel Cedric Leighton to help us understand this morning's developments. So, Colonel, can you explain to our viewers how a blockade like this would actually work, and what are the ramifications of that move?
Yeah, Manu, good morning to you. One of the things that you have to look out for is, of course, the geography of the place that we're looking at here, and that's the Strait of Hormuz in this case. So theoretically, from a geographical standpoint, this is going to be easier to do than, let's say, Venezuela or Cuba. But there's a lot of traffic that is supposed to go through the Strait of Hormuz, on average 135 ships a day before the war. So there's a lot that has to be controlled here. And so what the blockade would probably look like is that the U.S. forces would principally be focused in the southern approaches, basically from the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea into the Strait of Hormuz, that 21-mile wide gap that we're seeing right there. And the other part of it, the northern part, may very well be controlled by the Emirati and Saudi and other Gulf Arab states. So what they would have to do is they'd have to work together. Now, the president of the United States has not said anything about the Saudis or the Emiratis or the Bahrainis or anybody else getting involved in this. So that's that would make it easier if they did. But let's assume for a second that the U.S. was the sole country to do this. You would have to have basically a fleet of destroyers out there, coupled with at least one, preferably two aircraft carriers that could maintain maritime surveillance over the area. And then what they're trying to do is they're trying to prevent any ships that paid Iranian tolls from getting through the Strait of Hormuz. So if that's the case, that could set us up for a conflict not only between Iran and the United States, which is already happening, but also potentially with other countries such as China, which have paid tolls that allow their ships to go through. So it's an area where we have to be very careful what happens next. But that's basically what this blockade would look like. Yeah. On the surface, it's simple. In fact, it's going to be really complicated.
Yeah, and I wonder, could this backfire in any way, Colonel, this move? Because the U.S., of course, needs the Strait of Hormuz open as well. I mean, couldn't this blockade backfire on the U.S. in any way?
It could. For example, the Iranians could decide to put more mines in the Strait of Hormuz, and that would complicate any mine clearing operations, which, according to President Trump, have already begun. So you've got mine clearing operations that could be complicated by extra mines. There could be attacks by small vessels, such as the dhows, which is basically the native ships in the Persian Gulf area, and also the other small boats and fast boats that the Iranians still have. So in spite of their navy being basically decimated, you would have the capability, the Iranians would have the capability of putting a stop to traffic using smaller craft and asymmetric attacks such as mines and other efforts such as even missiles from shore-based batteries.
Colonel, is Iran really susceptible to this kind of economic pressure from the United States?
It depends. To some extent, yes, because 90% of their oil pre-war goes through the Strait of Hormuz and through the Karg Island terminal. So if you combine the blockade with, let's say, an attack on Karg Island and an occupation, even a temporary occupation of Karg Island, that would have a major impact on the Iranians, no question about it. So they are susceptible to this, but there are also other ways for the Iranians to circumvent this. They have a Caspian Sea connection with Russia, for example, so they could use the Caspian Sea for trade between Iran and Russia. It would minimize a lot of what they're able to do through the Strait of Hormuz currently, but it would allow them to at least have a lifeline, and that would not be controllable by the U.S. in any meaningful way. It also impacts the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states, and they will be clamoring for a resolution to this issue.
With us now is retired General Wesley Clark. He's the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. So the Strait is already effectively closed. Is this blockade likely to either get Iran back to the negotiating table, force to reopen the Strait, or does Iran have the leverage here? How are you seeing this?
Well, I see this blockade is helping the United States by giving us leverage. We're blockading not only the Strait, but all the Iranian coastline. So you may recall that last week, a couple of Chinese ships docked in Iran, not through the Strait, but along the Arabian Sea, and delivered rocket fuel, or what's required as a component of the rocket fuel, to Iran. We didn't stop that apparently, but we'll stop it from here on. And so this cuts off their ability to do trade. They can't come out of the Strait or use other ports along the Iranian coastline. So it definitely gives us leverage. It's difficult, takes a lot of ships, a lot of attention, but I'm sure we're going to be able to do it.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about that. What's needed here, the military assets? What would go into creating a blockade like this?
The question is, how close can you get to the Iranian coast? And then how much do you need to seize or secure these vessels if they're trying to run the blockade? So we'll take, let's say, 8 to 10 destroyers or frigates, spread them along the coastline. We'll have a couple of carrier task forces behind that, deeper away from the Iranian coastline. We'll have aircraft overhead. We'll be observing. We'll also have satellite coverage. We'll see the ships. We'll know who they are. And the ones that are not affected, not going and working with Iran, no problem. If they're going into the port, coming out of the port, or destined to go through the Strait of Hormuz for Iranian ports or come out from those ports, they will be stopped and seized according to Central Command. So it is a big military commitment. It's both carrier task forces, but that's what they're trained to do.
What about the risk here for the service members?
There's no R&R for the people that are out there. I mean, this is a extended deployment, so they're going to be out there for a long time. Now, we have to be aware that Iran has area anti-access, area denial munitions. As President Trump said, the carrier Lincoln was attacked by 101 missiles. So we're not going to get the carriers very close to the coast. The destroyers will have to pace themselves. Will they be 100 miles, 200 miles? Got to have some standoff. They've got to have air cover on them out there. And so this is a tricky mission. But right now, the ceasefire is still in effect. Now, Iran has said this blockade violates the ceasefire. But it's one thing to say that. It's another thing to start shooting. If the shooting starts, it'll certainly be returned, and it'll be returned very forcefully. So I think this is a necessary step up in leverage for the United States. I'm sorry that all of our European allies haven't participated in this, but that's okay. We've got an adequate force out there to do this, and hopefully it will have its effect, and we'll be back to the negotiating table with greater leverage soon.
U.S. Central Command says this blockade, scheduled to begin right now, will be enforced, and I quote, against vessels of all nations entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas. What does that actually look like in practice, to your mind?
Well, in practice, Becky, the U.S. Navy is going to be working hard to have visibility on all the ports as well as all the ships. And just watching your graphic earlier, you can see there's still a lot of activity out there, even if it's not moving through the Strait. So having the effect of an unblinking eye that is constantly watching everything, potential threats, potential ships that might need to be stopped. And of course, they'll know which ships are Iranian ships or they're flagged by other countries, which ones may have already paid some sort of a toll. This will be an important part of the operation. It's not just the ships that are out there, but it's knowing about what is out there and what's moving.
So, and how will they intervene to prevent vessels of all nations entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas?
Right. So, of course, there's maritime traffic, there's rules for moving at sea, there's communications that all of the different ship's captains are speaking over. And so the Navy, the Navy's commanders will address the ship, to tell them to stop, wait to be boarded, or to respond to whatever orders they might get from the U.S. Navy. So there's a lot of communication that's going on between the blockading force and those ships that may be subject to either boarding or the need to return to port, or whatever instructions are going to be given. So it's not like they're out there banging into each other. There's a lot of communication that has to go on. Obviously, if somebody disobeys or disregards what they're being told by the U.S. Navy, then it gets a little bit more dicey.
Just to bring people up to speed here, okay, this is the Strait of Hormuz. This is the 20-mile stretch separating Iran from Oman here, only about a 2-mile shipping lane. And for the last 6 weeks, there's been virtually no traffic through, just 1, 2, maybe 3 ships a day. And it's important to note that almost all of those vessels have been leaving from Iran. These are the various oil ports on Iran's coast. They've been Iranian vessels, or they've been vessels that Iran let through carrying Iranian oil, bringing back money, sort of, to Iran. So if the United States does carry out this blockade, talk to me about what the goal here is.
Well, John, you had it right. Look, every time I've negotiated with Iran, they come in, they're the weaker power, but they come in with something. They understand that no negotiations work without leverage. And they come in, they're holding hostages, or they're attacking American troops, or I've been with the Iranians in Oman where they shut down a passage in the Red Sea through the Houthis, one of their proxies. So what happened in Pakistan, John? Iran came in and basically put a proverbial loaded gun on the table. And they said, we control the Strait of Hormuz. The strait will remain closed other than our ships and ships that we approve through a passageway up near the Iranian border. There's kind of a separate route. And the Americans could have done 2 things. They could have tried to put more on the table to try to open up the Strait of Hormuz, or put a bigger gun on the table. And that's basically what's happened. And this will go into effect, John, in 2 hours. Whether or not it works, we'll see. But it's basically the Americans saying, actually, what's going to happen is the strait will be open to everyone but your ships. And this is the first time ever we're in uncharted waters, no pun intended, that we have a blockade on Iran. They cannot get their oil out of the Gulf. And it's a big move that we're making. I think the Navy can do it, but we'll see how it plays out. Now, importantly, John, the ceasefire is in place. So the ceasefire lasts until April 22nd, and this is kind of, I would see this is still a negotiation. It doesn't mean that we're on the precipice of the war starting again, but Iran could react here by breaking the ceasefire. They could strike ports in the Gulf. They could strike some ships. I don't think they'll do that, but this is going to play out here over the next week. It's a big move that President Trump just made, and it is going to really bite the Iranians if it works, because this is their economic lifeline.
So you said something very interesting there, and what the president has said is that other vessels leaving from other ports can go through. If you're from Qatar, if you're up in Kuwait, the UAE, those vessels can go through. But the Iranians have been saying they can't. And there's no indication that the Iranians are going to change that position. So the end result here might be, at least for the time being, that nothing gets through the Strait of Hormuz. And that's what oil markets are reacting to this morning. You can see prices up 7%, West Texas and Brent crude. Then the question becomes, is who can sort of withstand more pain for the longest period of time here, Brett? Is it Iran suffering because it's not getting anything, or is the rest of the world suffering from the jump in oil prices? What's your sense of who can last longer?
That's right, John. I remember standing there by that board very early in this crisis saying, war is ultimately a test of wills. And that is still what we see playing out. I think the Iranian side are very surprised, actually, that the American side made this move. I do not think they anticipated it. I thought they believed that the economic pressure was really biting and that we were going to have to kind of sue at the table to try to get the strait open. And we've now done the opposite. But yeah, it's a test of wills. I mean, so far here, actually, the American side and the president are showing that they are determined to achieve at the negotiating table now what they have demanded from the beginning. And that means an abandonment of Iran's enrichment program, which is the cornerstone of a nuclear program if you want to have the potential for a weapon, and some other things that they're demanding. It's a high-stakes game, John. I don't know where it's going to go, but I do think, given that the Iranians are using the Strait of Hormuz as their main leverage card, and they've said it openly, it's what we've known they might always do for decades. It's one reason we actually never did a military campaign like this, because of the risk. They're now doing it, and we're trying to combat it by saying, okay, well, if you're going to shut the Strait of Hormuz, it's going to be shut to your tankers, and we will use our assets to open it to others. One important thing, John, over the weekend also, while these talks were going on in Pakistan, and I don't want to just drive by the fact these were the highest level talks between the Iranians and the Americans since Iran's revolution in 1979. So it's, again, unprecedented. But 2 American naval destroyers went through that international passageway in the Strait of Hormuz that's been used for decades, that the Iranians have said is mined and is dangerous. That was an important show of force, and again, trying to build confidence for the shippers to use that passageway. But this is going to take a long time. I dealt with this in the Red Sea, even when we had a military coalition to help open it up. It's very difficult for the confidence of the shippers and the insurance companies to put those ships and those cargoes through. But let's hope it works.